We're here with composer, musician, Ken Ueno, and he is one of the wonderful artists in our series, Sakamoto Blue Sky. And we're here to have a brief conversation with him about his work. So welcome, Ken. Thank you for...
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah. So your piece for me is really beautiful. When I first watched it and listened to it, because you gave it to me with the film footage at Minidoka concentration camp. And of course, for those of us who know the history of the Japanese American camps and like myself as well, had family, in my case on both sides, who were in camp, not at Minidoka specifically, but in other camps nonetheless. It was really affecting, and to have that sound of the sho instrument playing, in that scenery, which is both beautiful and haunting as well. It had a very deep effect on me. So I'm just curious, kind of what was the genesis of the work?
Yeah, well, I've been working on a documentary on the only senior role model I have as a Japanese American composer, Paul Chihara, who I believe is turning 84 this year. He's like the only role model I have, really. And got a grant from the National Park Service a couple of years ago. And last year, I took Paul back to Minidoka with my film crew, and that was a powerful experience for me. I hadn't visited a camp before, and to go there with him, and as part of it, this project, I commissioned him to write a solo violin piece because he used to play the violin as a child, and to have Jennifer Coate with us perform the piece at Minidoka as a kind of art cleansing ritual, make something positive, and it was important to have it performed there too as part of this this project. But I also took a lot of B-roll, and then just seeing the buildings that are still there and kind of falling apart, and I thought it would be most appropriate somehow in showing some of this footage of the landscape what's there, to have an underscore with Japanese traditional instruments. So I wrote two short pieces, one with sho, which is a traditional mouth organ used in gagaku, and another short piece with shakuhachi, which I have another scene of these railroad tracks in another part of near the camp, which used to haunt Paul as a young person in his nightmares. And so we went, but there's something about the show that is ethereal and kind of heaven towards, right? So as I was writing the piece, around that time, Ryuichi Sakamoto passed away. So I thought of him too, and then I thought of how many more times I see the full moon, and the track from Async as well, and Paul Bowles, and all of the richness of all of those things together, and how sometimes Gagaku was performed outside and a palace in Kyoto, while the emperor could look at the reflection of the moon in a man-made lake, right? All of those things kind of coming together, and somehow I felt it appropriate to also make an homage to Sakamoto-san at the same time.
So that's so interesting. You just mentioned the moon reflecting pool in the palace in Kyoto. Did you know that that was something that Sakamoto also thought of himself?
No, I didn't. when I thought about the show, I thought about that because it used to be, there was like a in this particular palace, there's an outdoor kind of pavilion that overlooks a little lake, right? And then there's like a mountain, and then it was all purposely built there for the reflection, right? Yeah, and with the soundtrack in mind. So thinking about the show and the history of the show actually took me there.
Wow. Just the confluences just sort of happened organically. It's so cool. For those listeners, audience who aren't familiar with the reference, so how many more times will I see the full moon rise is a line from the Paul Bowles novel, The Sheltering Sky, the movie version of which Ryuichi Sakamoto did the score for, and years later, about 25, 26 years later, on his solo album Async that Ken just mentioned a second ago, there's a great, wonderful, beautiful track called Full Moon, in which he references that again in like 10, 12 different languages or something like that.
It also has samples of Paul Bowles himself, right?
Correct. Yeah, from the
Yeah,
film, because the Bertolucci,
yeah.
Bernardo Bertolucci, the director of the film, who was a longtime collaborator of Sakamoto, he scored 3 of his films in the 80s and 90s. Um, he gave Ryuichi permission to use the excerpt from the film soundtrack of Paul Bowles' voice, which happens at the end of the film, and then as Sakamoto was recording the track and gathering the line in other languages, he asked Bertolucci to recite the lines in Italian. And that was just coincidentally or not, because there are no coincidences, right? That turned out to be, I believe, the last public, sort of artistic expression that Bertolucci ever recorded in his life before he passed. So yeah, pretty intense, pretty amazing. Please, for those of you who don't know the album, go check it out now. Async, ASYNC, amazing album, and Sakamoto's personal favorite of his albums in his career. You were lucky enough to have an experience interacting or working with him a little bit. I believe he visit UC Berkeley, where you're a professor? Was it, am I remembering correctly?
Yes, about 10 years ago, we have a thing through the Center for Japan Studies called the Berkeley Japan Prize. And each year we think of a luminary, especially in the arts, who has contributed to helping to promote or become a real icon of Japanese culture abroad, right? And so for people like Murakami and Miyazaki, right, that we had given it to. And then it was my turn to suggest a musician. And I thought, oh, maybe the most renowned Japanese musician of all time is Sakamoto. And he had friended me on Facebook for some reason.
Really?
And so I had a contact, and I was able to kind of communicate directly through him and invite him, and he agreed to come, and it was fantastic. I was able to invite him for a colloquium. We had different panels, and some of my colleagues who are in environmental sciences, of course, because of his anti-nukes activism, was interested in also having him on panels in their department there. And we had a concert. Is maybe the best attended concert at UC Berkeley that I've helped produce, and he invited me to perform with him at the very beginning of the concert. That was a great
Wow.
honor, and maybe still the coolest thing that happened to me at UC Berkeley as of yet.
What did you perform with him?
He played piano. He played a whole recital on piano, and I used my voice.
Oh, no. So it was an improv, or?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Wow. So tell us a little bit about, what Ryuichi Sakamoto means to you. Why did you feel called to, not only create the piece when he passed, which, of course, is a very acute moment for a lot of us in the arts community. But obviously for you as a composer, I mean,
Sure. I mean,
especially.
as a composer in the United States, person of color, going to conservatory, most of the curriculum, everything I learned was so heavy on the on German composers, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, right? And then I remember in graduate school, there was a moment of crisis. I looked in the mirror and like, none of these composers look like me. Am I allowed to do this? How can do I have the same access? What does it mean for me? You know, and at that time, none of my teachers had even introduced me to composers like Takemitsu, right? And then I had to find people like Paul Chihara and Toshio Hotokawa, maybe Japan's most eminent living composer, who I was able to bring this year for the Berkeley Japan Prize. But along with that journey of kind of discovering Japanese composers, discovered quite early on Ryuichi Sakamoto, and he's not just a composer; he's a rock star, actor, activist. He's just such a force, altogether. And I also appreciate, as someone who actually got into music through like rock and more pop and electronic music and that kind of thing, that Ryuichi Sakamoto's output is so broad, and it it the older way maybe of saying what he did was like he crossed boundaries, but I think it was much more natural. He just did what he wanted to do, right? And it just ended up kind of inhabiting different kinds of musical genre like spaces, but he was actually making his own space.
Yeah.
And Takemitsu did that too, because he also composed for film. And if you listen to a lot of his film scores, they're so different. And he has like tangos and folk songs and rock songs, as well as film scores that use traditional Japanese instruments. And Sakamoto also has that breadth of output, but also being a pioneer, especially of electronic music. So
There's that famous
yeah.
meeting I guess, kind of infamous / famous meeting between the two of them. Did you know about that story?
No, I don't.
So when Ryuichi was a young Turk, kind of he was an undergrad in music school, and this is in the late 60s, early 70s sometime. And by that point, Takemitsu, of course, is a very famous composer, musician. And because he was, using a lot of traditional instruments, and a lot of the younger folks kind of rebelled against that, because it was the time, and it was like, oh, well, why are you being such a traditionalist, et cetera, et cetera. And so he actually, Ryuichi Sakamoto actually protested at one of his concerts. And he showed up, and then Takemitsu, and afterwards Takemitsu like went up to him, and Sakamoto's like, whoa. And he's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And I think he kind of stumbled through some kind of answer, because he wasn't expecting Takemitsu to like directly address him. And they ended up having this like half-hour conversation, and then they became friendly. And eventually, of course, they became colleagues. And before Takemitsu died, they had this dream project, because they both loved Ozu Yasujiro films. And they were like, why don't we rescore all the films? Because we love his films, but we don't like the music. And they actually had this plan to at least do like all their favorite Ozu films together, which would have been amazing. But then Takemitsu got in poor health and died. But I just love that story, because both of them being so open, right? Like even in his sort of like fiery chip on his shoulder youths, Sakamoto was still like, well, I get it. Like I understand what's what, even if I can't articulate it yet, as a young man. So I just
Yeah.
thought that was so cool.
Wow. That's a great project.
Any other, sort of like inspirations from artists like Sakamoto of how one can have a career, which you pointed to earlier as a musician. Um, but he was much broader than just that definition, and so are you. Any thoughts, just about what it means to have a career that creates its own path? How do you do it?
Sure. Well, I am a composer. I write uh, notes on the page for other musicians to play, but I also perform myself as a vocalist. And as a vocalist, I invent my own technique. I sing multiphonics, I circular breathe. I use the megaphone sometimes in different kinds of ways. I have a technique that I've developed in terms of in ways I use the megaphone in particular, but I also collaborate with architects to create spaces that are instrumentalized. So instead of traditionally like a symphony might be composed and it would inhabit different concert halls, right? But maybe because I think each space is an instrument. There's a resonant frequency and a particular kind of resonance, right? So if we and if we can imagine space from the onset to be kind of appropriately designed for an experience, um, those are some of the things that we could work on nowadays. But I'm also interested in well, I'm also a scholar, and I'm also interested in thinking about um, trying to help other people who look like me have a kind of claim and agency in space to work in academia and what's still called classical music. That's still seen as the kind of default space of training and expectation in terms of output and habitus. And I'm still also trying to think through my pathway through these different spaces. And so I go and give talks and also write about these kinds of things too.
um, on the point of classical music, spending a whole career circulating through the classical recording and stage performance world, he also, I think, did a lot to redefine, what it means to be a part of that world, and of course, doing it his own way. Do you have any thoughts or feelings about, Ryuichi as a quote classical artist or classical, based or adjacent artist?
Sure. I mean, he's a pianist, and so um, being trained as a pianist, that I think grounds you with some of that legacy. And I understand towards the end of his life, he was practicing a Bach, and also in his last album that it came out posthumously on his birthday, the tracks are named after the date that it was composed, right? But one of the tracks that has a name is the Saraband, which is also I take to be a reference to the Bach, say like the cello suites, right? It's a slow movement in three, and so that his last album and the last track that actually has a name is still a nod to Bach, I know, classical legacy. Um, and perhaps that gave him some measure of comfort, music, and how he uh, engaged with it, through his body by playing, right? And it was an important part of his daily regimen still, right? Um, and maybe it was part of a kind of therapy too, not only physical, but emotionally, mentally, and so yeah, I okay. When we talk about having access to classical music or being a composer and trying to expand that space, it is not that we don't love it. You know, you can, if being trained, we as musicians and playing it and listening to it and influenced, right? It's it's a different thing than and trying to open up the space for different kinds of people to have access to it, as well as trying to expand that space too, right? So, of course, Sakamoto can't be labeled or pigeonholed as just a classical composer, you know, because he did so many different things, and his music is so broad. He's a rock star, right? He's the electronic music pioneer. He had songs that were covered by Eric Clapton and Michael Jackson. I mean, it's, you know, what composer can claim? I mean, like a Western classical composer can claim that, right?
All bulls to Michael Jackson.
So Bertolucci in Academy, well, yeah, right. So, yeah, uh, and in his personal space, he's, you know, playing Bach. That, you know, it speaks more to the openness, um, and you know, and perhaps when we're facing our ultimate end, we can seek comfort with the music that gives us the most comfort.
Mm.
And yeah.
Any final thoughts, parting thoughts
Oh,
about?
one of Sakamoto's last projects also had show, right? Mayumi Miyatai was the stage thing.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Fine.
right, yeah,
Is sort of like opera, you know, I think it's the same definition that Robert Wilson has of opera, you know, it's just, he uses the word opera as like kind of in that Gesamtkunstwerk kind of way, you know, it's a total theater music thing. But yeah, with
yeah, yeah.
who's the show instrumentalist?
Mayumi Miyata,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
she's arguably the most important show player. We helped also bring show into contemporary music,
right.
collaborating with like Stockhausen and John Cage and, you know, different composers, Takemitsu, Hosokawa, Ken Ueno.
There you go.
Yeah,
Yeah, Time was his last stage piece that he worked on in his life with I'm forgetting on camera. Sorry, folks. The great director of the Japanese multidisciplinary performance ensemble and theater company, Dumb Type. And what a lot of people don't know who know contemporary theater and know Dumb Type, that actually Ryuichi had joined officially as a member of Dumb Type in the last couple of years of his life. So Time was actually his first official collaboration as basically just a member of the company, which I thought was so cool. He was like, "Yeah, I'm going to be one of the guys again." You know, when he's like 70 years old. I just thought that was so cool. So
yeah, right. Beautiful. To be so forward-looking in life, a new thing, right? Something that you haven't done before, or you're taking on new projects, new roles.
yeah,
Um, I am thinking of well, Calvino says that Joran says that when Socrates had taken the poison and was waiting his death, and he was learning a new melody on the flute, and then Joran says that his disciples said, but master, what good would that tune do you after you're gone? And he kept practicing. Maybe something like that.
wow, yeah, that feels right. Actually, that's great. Thank you for that, and thank you for your wonderful work, for participating in our series. And where can folks learn more about your work? Do you have a website they can go to?
Yes, kenueno.com. KENUENO, one word, .com. Yeah.
And for more about this series, you can go to fineartscenter.com or fac.umass.edu. Again, the series is called Sakamoto Blue Sky. Ken is one of 5 artists in the series, and we're rolling these out one by one each week in August and September. So look for those, and they're permanently online as a public resource. And we look forward to more with each of our artist friends and colleagues in the future. Thank you so much, Ken Ueno.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.